Is the director of the Water Science Institute, and we won't hold this against him, which is headquartered in Lancaster. Joe has, and forgive me, I have to read this, 40 years of business development experience in both the public and private sector. Notably, he was a past member of the Lancaster City Water Authority and past chair of the Lancaster Farmland Trust Board of Trustees. And he has worked since 2005 with Dr. Robert Walter and Dorothy Meritz to advance their research into the effects of historical land use practices on stream valley ecosystems. So it's with great pleasure that I thank Keith for bringing the program, and I welcome Joe Sweeney to the podium.
Thank you, Al. Everybody hear me? Okay. I want to first thank the Rotary for a wonderful reception and program. It's truly appreciated, and I hope we can reciprocate in kind today. But I do want to thank Representative Gillespie and the Chesapeake Bay Commission, which have been special partners with us. Ralph King is a staff member, and Keith is a legislative member of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, and hopefully that has, you'll see that has some bearing on today's subject. The subject's really about an old practice, an old technology, new science, and hopefully why that matters today. And so I'm going to go through this as well as I can. Throughout this area, not only central Pennsylvania, but throughout the Mid-Atlantic states, there has been an unknown and hidden form of pollution that is occurring and presenting part of our challenge as we try to clean up the Chesapeake Bay, our local waterways, and as we address local water quality issues through various permits that are going to be required or are required by the Environmental Protection Agency. These dams have had an impact that was unknown on the ecosystems of this area and throughout the northeastern United States. Essentially, what was happening is the landforms that you see outside today, the meandering streams that you see outside today, are not the natural formations of the land. They are what are known as legacy remains of past practices. A primary one has been mill dams. In this part of, throughout the United States, there are numerous mill dams that have had an impact on valley bottoms. The original valley bottoms were much different. They were low, flat, and mostly treeless wetlands that existed between these valleys. With the coming of settlers in the late 1600s and certainly by the 1700s, mill dams had become ubiquitous on just about every mile or several miles of stream throughout the 13 colonies and certainly throughout Pennsylvania. What happens when these mill dams were built is the former wetlands that did exist were buried by a combination of two things: the dam itself and the farming and logging practices on the hillsides where the dams were placed. So what would happen is erosion would come down from these dams, from these farming practices and milling practices, and would begin to cover up the existing wetlands that existed throughout these valley bottoms. Can you, this would be what would be a natural formation. The dam would be built. Farming practices would be incorporated as the water backed up. The trees would disappear, and then the erosion would begin. After a while, these dams filled up, and they filled up rather rapidly. In the late 1900s, we began to breach these dams, or they breached themselves as we went to different forms of power. And what happened was, this stream, sorry folks, this stream my bad.
Technology
Bad thumbs. Anyway, the dams would breach, eventually breach, and, or would be breached, as we're doing today. And what used to be a wetland is completely buried by sediment coming down from these valley sides after following the erosion, the farming and logging practices. Dam breaches, the small stream that you see forming there is essentially what you see today throughout York County and throughout the mid-Atlantic areas. That's not what was there before, but that's what everybody's familiar with. That's our legacy. That's the legacy of both the practice and the sediment that came down, and hence we call it legacy sediment. So today we have these huge plateaus. So that was what would happen on one mill dam. This is a map of where those mill dams are located throughout the Northeast. There it is, right, another way. This is just mill dam density. In some places there was anywhere from 8 to 64 per square mile. There's the dams that exist in Lancaster and York counties. These are the historic dams based on our research from the 1840 census. Besides these impoundments, there were many others that weren't reported. They could have been a farmer's pond. It could have been used for aquaculture, for ice, for livestock, for poultry. So there were many other impoundments. In fact, it's likely that on every 1 to 3 miles of valley stream in these counties and throughout the Northeast, some sort of impoundment was on the stream itself for one purpose or another. So you can see how quickly this could fill up a lot of sediment and impound a lot of potential pollutants. This is a typical site, and in here is where the original valley bottom was. It's a black layer. It's easily seen, perhaps not on this slide, but on site. It's a black layer. It's completely held by, it's completely part of organic matter. Above it is the sediment that has filled in behind a dam that no longer is intact. And then on top of that, what you would typically see is some trees, but mostly what they call a mesic wasteland of invasive grasses or other kinds of weeds. But that's typically the profile right there. Down there is the original stream bottom, the original wetland that was there, and above it, depending on the height of the dam, is the height of the sediment that filled in behind it. So here's what a schematic would look like. You would have, down here is the original water, water zone. It would be where the groundwater and surface water come together. This would have been the original wetlands, what they call hydric paleosoil. The legacy sediment filled in on top of those, impeding on both the groundwater exchange and burying the wetlands that were there. Again, the root zone, typically because legacy sediment is such a fine sediment, it's a very fine clay silica mixture. In fact, down there, if you want to pass around, is a bottle of legacy sediment. But this fine sediment that is entrapped behind, it was encapsulated behind these dams, is what you're seeing outside when you drive through Lancaster County or York County on a rainy day. It's that chocolate milk, that muddy looking mixture. And this is what it would look like as a cutaway. This is on an actual site where restoration was done. You see the same profile here. You see the water exchange between the groundwater springs in there and the surface water. You see the legacy, you clearly see the black organic matter. It was the buried wetland, the legacy sediment above it, and there's where a landowner named Sweeney tried to plant about 3,000 trees and shrubs on his, what he thought was his floodplain. And so this is what a typical site throughout Lancaster and York counties would look like, and is a typical profile for your streams and creeks. So a valley flat is not a floodplain, nor is it a riparian zone. And keep that in mind, because later on, when we talk about riparian zones, it's very important to understand practices. This is a typical, again, a typical looking stream throughout this, this part of Pennsylvania and throughout the Northeast. That was the landowner's attempt from a different angle. This is what the valley bottoms used to look like. You would have this tussock sedge, wet meadow, or wetland, which is what I'm using common term today. And these would basically stretch from valley side, valley wall to valley wall. And then the trees would, once you went upland, is where you would have the forested areas. And this type of system existed for nearly 20,000 years, up until 300 years ago. With the retreat of the glaciers, this is what your typical valley looked like in York County. In fact, this is in Chester County. This is one of the few intact valleys left in the Northeast. So, very different from what you see today. What we've attempted to do, and what we're going to talk about, is the removal of the legacy sediment and returning the valley bottom to some of, or as many of, its original functions as we're able to accomplish. And that was the whole point of this approach, which is to look at the legacy sediment that exists there and exists there. What happens is each one of those boulders that you see there, those large slab, are over a ton of sediment. And basically what happens is with these high banks, they become weakened by not water in during a storm event. A storm event basically scours them out and takes them downstream. Where most of this occurs, where most of the weakening of the banks occurs, is during the freeze thaw from January to March or April, and that weakens the banks. And then as the summer, spring and summer rains come or storm events come, it begins to scour out this kind of sediment. There's the classic picture. That is all the sediment, the chocolate milk, the brown from Hurricane Ivan in '04. And this is the Susquehanna River, taking all that sediment that I just showed you in that photo and thousands of other sites throughout the area down to the Chesapeake Bay. 4 million tons in that plume. It was estimated there were 4 million tons in that plume. It was a near record discharge of 775,000 cubic feet per second. And as an aside, and for the Chesapeake Bay, mandates that we're all being faced with in Pennsylvania, and certainly in New York and Lancaster County. 5 years ago, this kind of information, evidence didn't exist. So none of this is in the Chesapeake Bay model. So where they're attributing sediment from farmers as one example, potentially, may or may not come from, you know, farmland practices as we know them and as we've tried to improve them over the years, from agricultural practices, but rather from this other source. So how do we get from this and this to this and this? This is the experiment that began really 20 years ago with data, 8 years ago with scientific measurements. For 3 years, we measured various aspects of the land on our farm with the assistance of, primarily through the efforts of Franklin and Marshall professors, Robert Waller and Dorothy Meritz, along with a host of other folks. So this is one actual site before, and that's the exact same site nearly 9 years later. From 04, 05 from about 08 to 11, we did the measuring on what would happen if we did a restoration. In 2011, the fall of 2011, we did a restoration, and we've been measuring the results of that for the past 5 years. So since 2011 to 2016. The primary thing that we did is we went through a grueling process of permitting with every agency imaginable, because nobody had ever done this before or done it in this fashion before. And the basic premise was, instead of trying to hold back the banks, let's remove the banks, because the banks are going to remove themselves through those processes that I talked about. The freeze thaw and the stormwater scouring. So over the course of several months, after all the permitting was done, permitting took over 2 years. Just about every agency you can name, and a few that I didn't know exist, were engaged in overseeing the permitting and the actual protocol that we use for removing the sediment and then replacing, restoring the site. This is what we look like. This is one part of the site looked like before restoration. This is right after the excavation was done. This is a south to north view of about 12 acres of valley bottom on the site. This is what it looked like in June of 2014. There's what it looked like 1 year ago. That's it from another angle. So, what happened when we did all this? We removed 44 million pounds of soil, 53,000 pounds of phosphorus, which is 174, well, we'll get back to that, 66,000 pounds of nitrogen, 4.5 acres of wetland were restored. A riparian buffer was created in the upland on the valley walls, about 7.5 acres. Over 6,000 feet of stream were introduced back into this ecosystem. For all you fishermen out there, or just folks who are impressed by some amazing science, water temperatures have been reduced by 5 to 9 degrees. Summer water temperatures, which is just a staggering amount of reduction in any kind of restoration. Sediment reduction has been reduced by 50%, and I'll go to that a little later. But 50% of the sediment that was coming through there is now either been eliminated or is staying on site. Nitrogen activity because of the plant life has decreased, and the dissolved carbon has increased. We're sequestering more carbon, and we're taking nitrogen out of the system. Basically. A very important indicator, I didn't know this till about a year ago, is diatoms. Diatoms are single-celled animals that basically are very important indicators of the quality of water. In fact, they are becoming recognized as an important, simple, cheap way to assess water quality. And diatom diversity has substantially increased over the course of this restoration over the last 5 years. Question I'm always asked is, what you do with the dirt? The dirt was repurposed. It went up to, believe it or not, it went to a brownfield site that Franklin and Marshall College and Lancaster General Hospital were restoring on an old, I think it was a Conrail site. And so the dirt was the soil, really, was sent back up there. There's a backstory to it. I'm not going to go into it, but I hated to part with it. The final thing is there's been rapid habitat recovery. Once you take away that soil, you get down to that black layer that was there originally. It's like a chia pet. It came back within months, but within 1 year there was a substantial stabilization of the entire ecosystem, and it is just every year it's been exponentially better than the last year, to the point where by the second year, a Pennsylvania endangered species, threatened species, plant species, had reestablished itself on its own. Amphibians have come back, black ducks, wood ducks, both reestablished themselves, as part of their migratory pattern. There's amphibians throughout the area where there weren't any before. and it just continues to improve itself on on really a seasonal basis. This is a quick way to show the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, has 3 gauges, Fry, Sweeney, and Keener gauges on the site. The 2 at the top or 2 at the bottom measure the amount of sediment coming in. It was about 218 tons, I believe, a year. And after the restoration, that was reduced to 109 tons, 50% reduction. And that was attributed to 2 things, either the stabilization of the banks, the removal of the sediment, the stabilization of the banks, and the rapid recovery of the ecosystem through plants that were able to retain and trap a lot of the sediment coming into the from the unrestored areas. So generally, your restoration benefits, pretty obvious, I think, but I'll just go through, try and highlight some of them. It's immediate, it's not 30 years. I mean, literally this thing was producing, as I said, like a chia pet within 1 year. And certainly anyone who's been out there over the last 4 years can see that there's been dramatic improvement. There was a riparian buffer that was integrated right into it. We did stream bank fencing and crossings, so this is continuing to be in the center of a working farm, in the center of a working agricultural enterprise. Wetlands have been created. We've reconnected the groundwater with the uplands, so now where there used to be one channel, now you have springs and seeps coming out of the sidewall, the valley sides, and being integrated into the main valley, the main water, the main surface water of the stream. It's low maintenance. It's basically an appreciating asset. I mean, every year it gets better and better, and you're only spending as much time as you need to pick the litter out of the stream, just like you would anywhere else. But other than that, there's been very little maintenance required. A big thing is it reduces stormwater energy. It's estimated that the studies that we've done to date in USGS will have a lot of the data published on this over the next 60 to 90 days, is that you have a 50% reduction in stormwater flow, you have a 50% increase in stormwater capacity, meaning where you used to have this, what was basically, it's like changing from in your garden hose where you have it on jet and you change it to spray. That's what you have now. It went from jet to spray with this restoration. So there's been a 50% increase in capacity for the stormwater along there. Instead of shooting through, it will go right to, it'll spread out. So I said habitat. It's economical. We'll talk about that. In fact, it was less than 1.5 cents a pound to remove all that sediment, along with all of the other nutrients, the nitrogen, the phosphorus. You got the habitat, you got the storm water, you got everything else for just the price of removing that sediment, which is about 1.5 cents a pound. The total cost was about $650,000 to do that project, and that was a beta project. That may sound like a lot of money, but when we go to comparisons, you'll see why it's not. This is what you're going to be comparing to. PennVest is the largest over the last 30 years. The state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, has spent over $4 billion on various kinds of cleanup activities related to the Chesapeake Bay. $4 billion, about $130 billion or $130 million a year. I think over the last couple, Morel, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's about $130 million over the last couple of years, on top of that $4 billion. Most of that has gone to wastewater treatment kinds of facilities. I'm not against wastewater treatment facilities. I'm just pointing out that that's where most of that $4 billion is gone. The rest of the money, about $460 million, is going to Riparian Buffers and various other kinds of best management practice, green roofs, stream bank fencing, agricultural activity, no-till, things like that. So that $4 billion over 30 years has one common factor. It's above the stream, it's the edge of the field, and the policy is to prevent entry. The problem is, it's already in the stream. So a lot of that $4 billion, while it's important, is not going to be the best place to put the next $4 billion that we need to spend over, or we're likely to spend over the next 30 years, if not more and sooner. As a comparison, this is where we've spent 85% of our money on these three very high costs per pound forms of nitrogen reduction. This is where the project I just showed you is on that scale. In fact, when we talk about the wastewater issue, what they call point source, we basically over the past 30 years spent 85% of that $4 billion, 85% of the money on 15% of the problem. And that's why we don't have a problem with wastewater treatment plants or anywhere else, because we've spent 85% of the money on those. And that's fine. Now that we've taken care of that, let's move on and try and do something smart going forward. I want to just compare this very quickly to another very significant best management practices, they're called, and one that everybody's familiar with, and that's the whole idea of planting trees, of putting in riparian buffers wherever you can. Pennsylvania is obligated under its watershed implementation plan to, over the next 8 years, I think it is, plant 95,000 acres of trees along stream corridors. Well, if you just do a little bit of math, it's kind of problematic to do that. If you did 50-foot buffers on each side of a stream, which is a 100-foot buffer in total, it would require nearly 8,000 miles of stream. You would have to find 8,000 miles of landowners who are willing to let you put 100-foot buffers all along there. So is that an appropriate management practice? Maybe yes in some places, maybe not in others. But then you have to realize that probably 35 to 50% of those 8,000 miles are going to be inappropriate for planting trees for one reason or another. It could be landowner resistance. It could be just it's too rocky. It could be that there's already impoundments there. So you're not looking at 8,000. You're probably looking at more like 10 to 12,000 miles of stream that you're going to have to find to plant your 95,000 acres of stream. And then there's there's the benefit. There's the time lag on how long it takes. And then there is the fact that legacy sediment is still in the stream. So with that, I'm going to finish. This is the Great Marsh in Maryland. It was basically impounded by dams in the 1820s, 1830s. It was drained for the most part, except for this single channel that still exists. You can see how one large stream bed was created, and the rest was filled in by agriculture. So you went from a valley-wide wetland system to a ditch. You can see the meandering high banks. This is the restoration that I was talking about. This is Big Spring Run. Here's how it fits into the agricultural landscape. This is the unrestored part of it. You can see clearly the difference. There's your before, there's your after. Sorry it took so long.